Okay, so welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to cover the basics of the material manager and what you can do with materials and kind of the workflow and the way that a material works. And so go ahead and open a new file. And for this one, we're just going to create a couple base objects. I'd like us to create a cube, and we'll do a sphere and a torus as well. And what this will allow us to do is, actually we could do, let's do a cube, a sphere, a torus, and we're going to do the landscape as well. Because the landscape has some nice subtle variations in surface texture, and so we can kind of see that. But we don't need it to be as huge as it is, so let's go ahead and shrink that a little bit. And then just arrange these, and we can move our camera a little bit. But go ahead and just take a little bit of time to arrange these in the scene so that you can kind of see all of them evenly. So I'm just going to go ahead and move this over here. And, we're going to have a couple lights in the scene eventually. And so we're going to want all of these things to be somewhat evenly lit, but they don't have to be perfect. So wherever you want them, just so long as they're reasonably easy to see. Okay, so the other setup that we're going to do for this is we're going to create a floor. And that's because once we start putting the lights in here, we're going to want something for shadows to be cast upon. And something that starts to, if we're looking at reflective materials, something that will reflect off the surface of these materials, right? Because right now, if we render this, everything's going to be totally and completely black. And so when we go to, if we have a fully reflective object, we're just going to see emptiness except maybe the reflection of some of these other objects in here, but probably it's just going to be all black at this point, with maybe a couple specular highlights. So let's go ahead and create a floor. And so the floor objects, there's floor, sky, environment, foreground, background, etc., stage, and physical sky, and grow grass. And we're not going to worry about growing grass right now. But we're going to put a floor in so we at least have something that reflects. And we'll probably drop a sky in and make a material for that at some point too. But let's go ahead and just put in a floor. And you'll notice, right, all the objects are halfway through the floor. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and select all of these objects here. And we're going to lift them up a little bit. And these will be at varying heights above the floor. It's really hard to tell where they're at right now because there are no shadows. But they'll be at varying heights above that floor. And eventually we'll modify them so that they're closer or further so we can see what happens to the shadows. But let's go ahead and, so we've got these four objects. Let's go ahead and create a material. And we're going to start by just creating a white material for the whole scene. So we're going to double click. And once we've got this material created down here, by double clicking on it, we can double click on the material itself again. And the first option we have is to change the name of the material from matte to something else. And so I'm just going to call this base white. Right? So all this is just a simple white color with the default specular attached to it, and just color with this like 80% vibrance. And so let's go ahead and apply that to all the objects in the scene, including the floor. And so to do that, the most easiest way is just to drop these into the scene. And I already had all four of these selected in my object manager. So when I applied it to one of them, I applied it to all four. If you didn't have that done, you could either undo what you just did, select all four, and then apply it, or change your options. So now the other setup we need to do is we need to drop a couple lights in here. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a light. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lift it up a little bit. And then before I do anything else in terms of movement, what I want to do is I'm happy with the framing of this, and I might actually change my framing just a bit. What I'm going for is I want to be able to see these all four objects in the viewport at the same time. And so maybe I need to zoom out just a hair and move this over a touch. And then I also want to be able to see the horizon line so that I have some sense of the, because the floor basically goes out for infinity to the point where it becomes the horizon line. And so I want all of that stuff in view. So go ahead and set that up. And once you do that, go ahead and I want you to create a camera. And then we're going to go to our side view and our front view, and possibly our top view. And I just want to zoom out a little bit because you can kind of see where this camera is now, right? And where my light is. Let's go ahead and select the light in the object manager so we can see it. Right? What we want when we're testing materials is we want to have pretty even lighting, right? We don't want to do anything with like crazy colored lights or anything like that. We just want to use a couple lights to light the scene. And one of the ways that if you've ever seen any photo shoots where they're trying to create nice even lighting, one of the things that photographers will do is they typically have two light sources, one to either side of the camera. And so I'm going to go ahead and hold down, I'm going to hover over the control handles for the first light. I'm going to hit control and I'm going to click and drag to create another light and bring it over here. Now, once I have those two lights created, they're at a pretty good height. Maybe we want them to be a little bit higher. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my lights are separated by the camera in the object hierarchy, so I'm just going to drag one up. And something that we can do that we haven't really talked about a lot is any object can be the child of any other object. So if I want to be able to move these two lights at the same time, I can just drop one in as the child of the first light. And so then when I go to use these handles and say, oh, I want to move these, up. Oh, sorry. Well, I have to select the parent. If I select the parent light and say, oh, I want to move these up, they'll both move at the same time, right? And so this gives me a little bit more control. I could also create a null called light kit or lights or whatever. And so I could have a bunch of lights or different types of lights in there that then as I move the null around, I could have control that way as well. So right now I just have two lights. I'm just going to make one the child of the other. And the other thing you can do is when you have two objects of this that are similar or have similar attributes, like say two lights, is I can hold down Shift and I can make sure I select both of these lights and make sure they're highlighted. And then when I go down, I can go down to Shadow and I can click on Area. And it should turn on the area shadows in both. So if I click on light 1, the area shadows are on. If I click on light 2, the area shadows are set on that as well, right? So this works for any of these other settings as long as they are the same, or as long as I want them to be the same, right? If I suddenly wanted to change the exposition of both of them to the same point, I could do that as well. But usually it'll tell you if the values are different for the two objects that you have selected. Okay, so I've got some lights. I'm just going to go ahead and select the perspective view. I'm going to click render. And you can see that I've got some lights and I've got shadows being cast by these objects. And you can see that, right, depending on how high off the ground these are, the shadows look different. And so I could bring these things closer to the ground, but I'm just going to leave them where they are for now. There's some nice variation in tone on these surfaces. So I should get a pretty good read of of how these materials look on different surfaces as I go forward. So let's go ahead and get cracking. Let's open up the material manager for this base white color. So let's go ahead and we're going to copy this color, right? We want to leave this base white and we want to work from there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the control key, click and drag on this little icon to create a second one. And now with this new material that I've created, I'm going to go ahead and double click on that and open the material editor. And so in the material editor, we've talked about this briefly, but there's several different channels that are available to you. You can see the whole list here. I don't feel like reading all of them out. The ones that you typically end up using most are color, diffusion, reflectance, transparency, if you're making something transparent, and either bump or normal. More rarely you use alpha. If you want to do glow, you use glow. If you need a lot of geometry changes, displacement is also an option, and we'll look at that a bit later. But to start with, there's color. And so I'm going to make sure I have color selected so it's highlighted in orange. And then these are all the settings for the color channel. Now, the The very basic setting, right, is what color should I have this material be, right? And I can either click up here, which opens up this color picker, and I can choose things there, or I can just adjust the values here to choose the color. And there's also all these grayed out options here, right? This is RGB, so if you're more comfortable working with red, green, and blue values, you can use RGB. The K stands for Kelvin, right? So it gives us tint and temperature. This other option here is just this brightness mix essentially between two colors. Right? I can either choose one or two, or I can slide somewhere in the middle between those two. Right, and there's several others, right? If I know the hexadecimal number for the color, I can just paste that in there to get it. And then there's also swatches, right? So swatches are just basically you add colors or load a set of colors and a color palette that you want to use. For doing production stuff that needs to have the same color palette for every project, that's a really effective way to work. And this color from picture option basically allows you to choose an image, drop the image in there, and then choose the colors based on that image, which is pretty cool. There's this other version of color choice, which, I really like this hue and saturation. I don't know what you even call this color picker, right? They also have the color wheel. And so there are many different ways in which you can work. This one is like all of them combined. But yeah, so you have a lot of different options for how you choose your colors. Okay, so I'm going to go back to just hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'm going to turn off the wheel for now, although it's a lot of fun. The next setting is brightness, right? Which basically, and I have this set to some crazy color now. I honestly don't know if there's like a quick way to reset the color on this. Reset all. There we go. Look. All right, so we're back. All right, so if you right-click on the color title here, you can go down to reset all or reset to default, and it will do that for you. If there's a drop-down arrow like this, that means you can hide the settings, right? So it could just have the color here and not any of these other things, just to clean this up a bit. So brightness is the next setting, right? If I just have white, that means that, as I bring the brightness down, it's going to get darker and darker until it goes to black. Now, the next thing down is texture, and texture allows you to do a couple things. First, there are procedural textures that you can use. So if I click on this little arrow here, I can go down, and if I wanted a gradient as my color for my object, I could go ahead and click on gradient. And then the word gradient shows up here, and I have this little gradient image, and it gives me a couple settings here. But, I don't necessarily want a black and white gradient, and I probably don't want it going from left to right. So what I can do is I can click on the word gradient, and then all the gradient properties show up, right? So I can say, the type is 2DU. That means it's going horizontal. If I do 2DV, then it will go vertical. Right? You'll also notice that there's all sorts of other options in here, and so you can experiment with those. But we're just going to start with this gradient just to show what it looks like across the surface. And so what I'm going to do is, rather than black and white, let's just make it something obnoxious. So I'm going to double click on that little pointer, and maybe I'm going to go from teal of some variety to yellow, because that seems like it would be beautiful. All right, so I'm going to go from teal to yellow, and so now I've got this thing. Now, one of the other things you can do with with this gradient shader, and shaders are just procedural textures are called shaders. And so I can either uncheck cycle or check cycle, and what that does is, this is more for animation. Turbulence basically introduces noise at this seam. So if I make this 100%, right, you can see that my gradient breaks up into a sort of a cloud-like noise. And that can be, the detail in here can be controlled by the number of octaves, right? So if it's like 1 octave, it's going to be much smoother, right? Whereas if it was, say, 10 octaves, I don't even know if you can see all the detail that goes in there. But 5 is the default for this. Scale, if I set this to 20%, you can see that basically it zooms way in on one of those things. Or if I do 1,000%, right, then I'm going to get a bunch of tiny, tiny little details. And then frequency and seed and angle, right? Angle basically adjusts where this thing happens. I'm going to put this back to 0. And then seed, a seed value when you're working with noise or random values or pseudo-random values, which is what's happening here. If I put this back to 100, so we can, the scale back to 100 so we can see. If I change my seed value, you'll see it adjusts the pattern that's there. So I don't have to have the exact same pattern for every time I do this. So I'm going to reduce my turbulence down to 25%. I don't know what I'm making, but I just want it to be not quite even. Okay, so I've got this material set. So now the other ways that this works, right, is I can come up here and there's this back arrow, which is like the back arrow on your browser, and there's a forward arrow, which is like the forward, and there's the up arrow, which basically means, right, we accessed this shader through the color channel. So clicking on the up arrow means it's going to go up to the color channel again. And I can change the blend mode. So like if I wanted to say, let's change this base color. I'm going to change it to something obviously not what we're working with. So I'm going to make it this like garish, like near magenta pink. And so now if I go to my mix mode, right now it's set to normal and mix strength's 100%. That means that basically the gradient is overlaying whatever the color is. You can imagine that as like different layers in Photoshop, like the blend mode or the mix mode in Photoshop does that. And so if I change this, I don't have as many options, but I have add, subtract, and multiply. So if I do add, right, then I get this pinkish option here. And there will be some stuff on there, but it's hard to see. If I go to subtract, right, it's going to change that color dramatically because it's going to be subtracting this pink, or it's going to be subtracting this from that base color. If I go to multiply, right, it's just essentially going to make it darker. And then the other thing I can do is I can adjust my mix strength, right? And so if I do normal and I adjust my mix strength, right, you can see that more of the base color comes through and less of the top color shows up. If I go to add, I get a similar effect, but that mix mode is just a little different in the way that it works. And then the model, these are what are called diffuse layers, or diffuse surfaces. And so what that means is rather than being shiny and highly reflective in a sharp, clean way, diffuse means that the light basically scatters in all directions when it hits the surface. And so you get a much softer feel. And you can choose between Lambertian and Oren-Nayar. You can see that Oren-Nayar is a little bit flatter. And then there's a few options you can adjust. If I reduce that roughness, I'll have brighter highlights. If I increase the roughness, eventually I get like an almost completely even tone across the surface. And then the diffuse level, right, it basically is letting us choose, again, kind of how much light actually the diffuse is basically how much light gets absorbed versus gets bounced off the object. Okay, so that's the color channel, and it starts to introduce some of the ways that this functions. If I click on this little arrow down here by the texture, because I have this gradient shader, I can also access all of the gradient shader options from within the color channel. I don't even need to click on the word to go to these options, which is really nice because it allows me to make changes a little bit more quickly. So let's go ahead and apply this and see what it looks like real quick. And I'm just going to drop it on the sphere, and I'm going to drop it on the cube. And I might as well just drop it on all of these because, okay, and then we're going to go ahead and render this. Right, and so you can see how these things apply to these different objects, right? The sphere, I can't actually even see any of the darker color, right? And then it's a little bit chunky and ugly on all of these, but that's fine. But right, you can kind of see how it gets applied to the cube. And again, here a lot of this is left in the back. So if I go ahead and open up this texture and go and switch from 2DV to 2DU, and then render this, right? You can see that it adjusts basically how this texture gets laid across the surface. And so you can kind of see how these things are working around here. Okay. So, right, so that's one thing that we can do with this. Now, let's say we didn't want to use the gradient. There are several other options in here. Color is literally just color. But Fresnel, gradient, noise, there's a bunch of other effects we're not going to talk about right now. You can experiment with them, but there's some that need a lot of explanation to do, and we'll get into those as we go forward. And there's these surfaces like marble, right, which I think some of you have worked with, but again, this is a procedural texture, and there's lots of options you have for how this works. Now, the reason that this is pink right now is because if I close this up a little bit, that mix mode is still set to add and the mix strength is set to 78, right? So I'm getting a mix between this marble texture and this pink color that's underneath it. Again, if I was to say change this to multiply and then render it again, right, I'm going to get a much different result with the same two settings, right? It's just all the darker colors are going to come through and the lighter colors are going to disappear, right? Whereas add, it basically increases the brightness of everything on that surface. And so since this is good and ugly, I'm going to keep using it. So we've got these options, right? So let's create one more material because I want to show you something else you can do in this texture field. And then we'll go on. And the reason I'm just staying in this one channel is because this texture field is something that's going to appear everywhere. And this idea of creating procedural shaders is something you can do on, I think, almost every channel that you have access to. So I'm going to go ahead and select this beautiful pink marble. I'm going to hold down Control. I'm going to click and drag to create a new copy. I'm going to double click on that so that the material editor updates to use this new one that I've created. And in this new one, rather than do marble, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this ellipsis over here. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to come in and find an image and upload an image as a texture. And that becomes what the color channel will look like. And so it takes a lot of work to actually get things to usually look good when you do that, and we're not going to worry about that now, but I just want to show you that that's how that's possible. So I'm just going to come down and find an image. It's actually going to be in this other class. And just a note, if you were doing something with animation, you could also actually use a video rather than an image so that it plays back over time while you're doing your animation, which is pretty cool. So I'm just looking for the eye image that I used, and I have no idea where that went. Let's go ahead and, well, I'm going to use this Coke image. You can pull any image you want off your computer. It really doesn't matter. And so now I've got this Coca-Cola.jpg in here, and notice that I have the mix mode still set to add, and the mix strength set to 78. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and apply this only to the cube right now. And so now when I render this, you'll see that it's basically taken this image that's pretty long and narrow, and it's smushed it down so it fits within the one facet on the side of this cube. And then you'll notice it's also repeated on all the other sides, right? That kind of shows one of the things that by default Cinema4D does, which is to have all of your faces sort of stacked on top of each other, and then that texture map applied to all those faces. Specifically with a cube, it does that. it stretches things a little bit differently around the other objects, and you can go ahead and apply that with whatever image you've used. You can apply that to some of the other objects to see how that mapping works. And that's something when we get a little bit further along, we'll look at how to go beyond those limitations. Okay. So that's how this works. So let's look at we're going to look at one or two other channels, and then this tutorial will be done, and we'll move into how to create a metal material from scratch for the next tutorial. And so we'll go pretty in depth with it to give you some sense of how to build a really complex and beautiful material. So the other channel that gets the most use and is most important in making a material is reflectance. Now, reflectance has a lot of options, and something to note, the material editor just in general has a lot of options. There is a lot you can do here, and we're just scratching the surface. Within this texture field, one of the options is this layer option, and what that does is it allows you to create a whole bunch, to add multiple layers of procedural shaders, right? So we haven't looked at noise yet, but I could have a noise shader, a Fresnel shader, a gradient, a color shader. I don't know, I could bring some of these other effects in. So I can stack a bunch of stuff in there, and you can make really complex things. It's pretty amazing, but it takes a lot of work to do and do well. But I want to show you the general logic of how this works now, and then hopefully giving you enough information so that you can go forward and start creating some really killer materials. So the way that reflectance works is, by default, you have your default specular, which gives you these like mild highlights on the surface of the object. And if I just use the default specular, you'll see that it says Blinn and Legacy. Their new way of doing things, essentially you don't use the specular at all. You just create reflectance layers, a couple reflection layers, and you adjust those to give yourself the right kind of specular highlights. But we're going to go ahead and start here because sometimes it's all you need. And so there's a few settings here that are important. First, there's you can, if you have more layers up here, and we'll do that in a little bit, you can adjust the brightness and the way that they blend. You can either do add or normal. And then there's a global reflection brightness and a global specular brightness, right? And specular are these white highlights. It's not a reflection. It's more like the brightness of a light on the surface of an object is the best way to describe that. And so then, right, there's this specular, there's this also specular Phong Legacy. If I click on that one, you'll see the appearance is a little bit different in the preview. But I'm going to go ahead and just leave it at the Blinn. That's a little bit better algorithm. And so then there's all of these options. There's width, fall off, inner width, specular strength, and bump strength. Right. So width, I want you to watch this little graph here. This is a graph of the brightness of your specular highlights. And so if I increase my width, right, that curve broadens out, and then you'll see that the whole color of the light spreads and gets more diffuse on the surface, and it's not as bright. It's much more spread out. If I reduce that, and I'm just going to go down to like 13%, you can't even see the highlight right now, but that's because we have very little specular strength, right? And so if I go down, let's go up a little bit. Yeah, so you can start to see this here, right, where it's much sharper than it was before. We're not going to worry about fall off or inner width yet. We're going to go straight down to specular strength, because specular strength increases the brightness of those specular highlights, right? If I want something that's really shiny, I want that to be basically 100%. And I want the width to be pretty small. And when I go ahead and render this scene now with that setting, right, you can see that the objects look a little bit shinier, and it's actually kind of hard to see because of all the pattern on the surface. So maybe what I'll do is select this other material real quick, go to my color channel. Oh, actually I have to work with this other one. I was working on the Coca-Cola one. Let's go to this one, to the marble that we've made. Let's go to Reflectance, and let's go ahead and reduce our width down to like, I don't know, 13%, and increase our strength to like 100%. And then let's go ahead and render this. There we go. Right. So now you can see I've got my two lights, and so I can see these two lights reflected in the specular highlights. And if I move my editor out of the way, you can also see those here. They're not so visible on this shape because the angle of the object compared to like the light, you wouldn't see a specular highlight from the light into the view of the camera based on how this is set up. Right, but so if I have that strong, but I go ahead and increase my width and render this again, right, you'll see that those highlights, it's still shiny, but they spread out more. And this one actually finally becomes apparent. If I spread this way out, right, all of that detail is lost. These things are just basically beaming light back, back at me. Right, and so these two things, right, they, determine like essentially, right, if you have it at full brightness and you have your width pretty wide, you get kind of a glow sense off the object too, which is something to keep in mind as you're working. The inner width basically means that you have you can say take your width down, you can reduce your fall off, and if you increase your inner width, then you can create like a really hard edge, right? That looks completely fake, but I've created this very crisp edge around these circles because I have inner width that's this full brightness, but then my fall off I reduced to negative 42%, so it's basically just a straight line. If I pull the fall off out now, I can have essentially larger highlights, but still have that softer edge and not have quite the same spread that I had before, right? And if I change my offset, my fall off even larger, and I'm going to go ahead and reduce my brightness a touch. But if I make my fall off even larger, right, it basically just pushes those boundaries out, right? And it makes it full brightness elsewhere. So if I do somewhere in there, that's usually a nice transition, right? I'm going to reduce my inner width a little bit, render this again, and you can see that these do get smaller. And then if I increase my width with this, right, I can essentially make this a little bit more, right, bright. But again, you can only do so much, right? So this is what allows you to make, say like, oh, I have a really glossy marble stone or something like that. Or if I make the width a little bigger and I make my specular strength lower, and I get rid of all this, should probably still have some fall off, but I get rid of my inner width, right? Then I have something that appears to have a duller finish, right? It's not as sharp and sparkly. And so, yeah, if I go ahead and bring that out, and now if I up my fallout just a little bit, right, I can get this to even look more diffuse. And so really what you need to do is like you're looking at the material that you're working on and you're saying, okay, if a light's reflected in it, do I see that as a pinpoint of brightness, or is it just sort of smooth across the surface? So the other thing in reflectance is actually making something reflective, and we're gonna cover this in detail in the metals tutorial. But to start with, I just want to show you how to add a reflectance layer. And what's cool about reflectance is you can add a lot of layers. Your computer might be unhappy with you if you do too many, but you can add a lot of layers, and you can mix and blend these things. And we're going to do that when we make the metal, and you can get really pretty remarkable surfaces that come out of that. So with reflectance, I'm going to go ahead and click Add, and I'm just going to do, I'll show you later the difference between these, but we're just going to do GGX for now. Right. If I leave it set at the default, it has 10% roughness, which means that the surface it's going to be kind of a hazy reflection. But it also means that this is going to be like a perfect mirror, right? So nothing's getting through this. And so, when I render this, I'm actually getting a pretty great, like for the low quality render that I'm setting at, right? You can see those two lights hanging in space. You can see the landscape going out ahead of you, and you can see some of these things reflected in these objects, right? But that 10% gives it a feel like, and at least on my computer screen, it looks somewhat real, right? Because nothing is 100% like perfectly reflective. But if I need it to be in sharper focus than that, then I can adjust my roughness down so it's a lower percentage, and then I'm going to get an even cleaner reflection. If I go up to say 33%, right, the entire surface is going to start to get really, really hazy and look like it's like almost like it's been bead blasted or sand blasted, right? So, or sanded. So the surface is much coarser. And you'll see there's a lot of kind of noise in here. And that's something that we would fix with better render settings later, but we're not going to deal with right now because we want these to render quickly, right? We're not so worried about the render quality yet. And so within this, now I have this layer and it's set to normal. So what it's doing is it's essentially hiding everything under it, including my default specular. These little eyes here allow me to turn on and off the visibility of these layers. And then I can also change this from normal to add. And when I do that, even at this point, it's so reflective that even though it's being added to what's underneath it, I can't see any of that material that's under there. And so what I need to do is I need to reduce the brightness of this layer, right? And so if I pull this down just a hair to like 72%, right? Now I can start seeing this, I still see some reflection, but I'm also seeing this material start to come through the surface. And I can, I have my roughness set to 33. If I was to say drop that down somewhere closer to 10, you'll see that, right, anywhere where I'm not having light reflected from something else, now I can start to see this material. And I could make this very low if I put it at 20%, right? I'll get a little bit of the color reflected off the objects around it, but it doesn't look quite as shiny as it did before. And I can see these specular highlights. If I wanted to, I can turn these off. And so when I render this, then the only specular highlights I'm getting now are the ones from my reflectance layer, right? And those highlights are controlled by this specular strength setting in this layer 1 here. And so if I increase that, I should have brighter highlights, and they do brighten up a little bit, right? I don't have all those adjustments where I can change the shape and size and the fuzziness of it, except to adjust this roughness. If I blast this roughness out all the way, then I get a really flat object. So reflectance basically takes over everything that default specular does, and you don't really need it. You can make your own diffuse materials in here. We'll talk about how you add color, and you could do most of your material work in here without using the color channel at all. So you can see that with full roughness, this is very, very flat in color. And as I go down a little bit, right, I don't see that much reflection because I've dropped the strength so much here, but I can see those highlights coming through. And this is how you can make those adjustments on those highlights. Okay, there's a lot of other settings here, and we're not going to get to those in this because the last thing I want to do is I want to show you the bump channel because that's the other one that gets used a lot for making materials. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on the bump channel to make sure it's on. And then I don't have many settings here. What the bump channel does is it takes a two-dimensional image or a procedurally generated shader, like noise, which is what we're going to put on there, and it uses that to fake texture on an object. And so if I go to texture, I click on this drop-down arrow, and I go down to noise, and I don't do anything else at all, and I render my scene. you'll see that suddenly there's a whole bunch of texture on here, right? And what's happening is this noise map here is being applied to the surface, and then based on the algorithm that they use, they are taking the shine, they're basically adjusting where the highlights are and where the shadows are generated from based on how this object is. Now, something you'll notice if you look closely or get closer to the object is that it does not change the shape of your sphere. The edge of your sphere is still a perfect sphere, right? It just changes the surface. So it's best, the bump channel is best for when you're trying to add really like light surface texture. Like say, like if you look at your hand and you can see all the lines and things in your hand, that would be done with a bump channel, right? It's not so big that you are going to like need to change the geometry to accommodate it. It's just something that would really only ever cast a shadow on itself on the surface. And so let's go ahead and click on the word noise. We could also, again, remember, turn this drop down, and maybe that's better, so we have all the settings in one. So I have this noise, and there's noise, again, has a ton of settings. We're going to go through a lot of them later, but what I'd like you to do is play a little bit. And there's a couple things you can play with that have big impacts. First, one of them's the type of noise. And there's this drop down of all these names. However, there's also this little tiny arrow to the far right. If I click on that, it actually shows me a preview image of what the different types of noise look like. So you can just go ahead and be like, oh, I want to see what that looks like on my surface. And this is called electric. And so if I render this, right, you can see what that texture does to this material. And if I go down, we kind of talked about octaves a little earlier, but if I come in here, right, the octaves are set to 5. I can make that adjustment to 2 or 1 to adjust how intense this is. If I adjust these two colors, it's going to change this from being black and white to something else. And it doesn't adjust the color of this object at all. All it adjusts is essentially the intensity of change between the bright parts and the dark parts, right? The dark parts push into the surface of the object and the light parts push out of the surface. And so if I wanted it to be a bit more subtle, oftentimes you'll see people say, you know, they'll have something in this like, you know, pink range on one side, and then on the other side they might do something that's like a little bit closer to like a bright teal. So you can still visually see the difference, but you're much, that's a little intense. Let's dial that down a touch. Right, so you're still in a place where, right, now I still have that texture on there, and actually I'm going to zoom my view in a little bit so you can see it better. Right, there is texture on here, but it's much, much, much more subtle. Right, and so because these colors are really close together, if I you know, decrease the saturation on one of these a fair amount and up the vibrance a little bit, right, I should get a little bit more texture when I'm doing this. And I am getting a little bit of a difference, right? The black and white was clearly significantly stronger, right? So if I drop this back down to black, and maybe if I just leave it set like this, right, now you can see I get a lot more texture, right? And so this is a way where that's one of the ways you can adjust that. Something else to look at is the number of octaves, if that's a setting. And so 5 is where it's at. If I go down to 1, right, I'm going to get this much smoother surface. If I go up to 10, which I'm going to get layers and layers and layers of noise that will add more detail. 5 is usually about all you need, but and the other thing that we can do is we can adjust these global and relative scales. So if I set this to 20%, what that's going to do is it's going to make this pattern significantly smaller, right? So you can see that all this noise is just jammed together right now. If I go and actually I should make this maybe 5 octaves instead of 10. But if I make this global scale, say 400%, then I still have noise on the surface, but it's much, much, much bigger. And so maybe 200% would be easier to see, because 400% really smooths it out. Yeah, there we go. That's better, right? So you can see that it's having this impact, but it's much more spread out. And then these allow you to make it more either streak in one direction or another, right? So if I say make this 10% in one of these, right, I'm going to get things all smushed up. And so when I render this, right, I get more something that looks like scratches on the surface. And so that's another thing you can do to make these adjustments. And there's a bunch of other things in here you can tweak on and take a look. The movement and speed are for animation, and the animation speed is also for animation. And that means, right, all of these procedural things can move in time. And so the surface, like if you were animating this, the surface could be, you know, that surface texture could be kind of rolling around as you do it. And then there's brightness, contrast, high clip, and low clip. You can play with those as well to see what that looks like. Right, so these are the 3 channels I wanted to start with. And I'd like you to just experiment with these and see what types of materials you can come up with just this little bit of information. So play a little bit before you start the next tutorial.